All right, strap yourself in. This is going to be a long one. It's going to be a long one because there is some really, really cool stuff I want to talk about, and this was always the plan. I was going to talk about the cool stuff. It's also going to be a long one because there's some less cool stuff that I want to talk about because it was a kind of a big issue over the last day. Plus, there is actually some interesting technical stuff to talk about as well, related to this other thing. Now, you'll notice, for those of you watching the video rather than listening to the podcast, and incidentally, I know last week's podcast didn't go out on time. I uploaded it. Something went funny in the wires. It didn't get downloaded into the... I don't think it was just the iTunes playlist. It might have been the other lists, the Google playlist, etc. as well. Didn't go out on time. I'm going to actually double check the thing today as well. So, yeah, sorry about that. So anyway, if you are watching, you'll see that I'm in a different position. I'm in my comfy chair today, in part because I'm exceptionally tired after this week, which is why I'm also sitting here drinking espresso. Also in part because very, very unusually for where I'm located here, the weather is not very good. If you're in the UK, I know you're laughing. You can have that one. But it is actually belting down rain. In fact, I started recording this in the normal spot, and then I looked at the camera, looked at the video, because normally I look at the camera, but I looked at the video, and I went, wow, I look really dark. This is not very good at all. So I've moved into another position, but hey, it's cool. It's really a bit of variety. Now, I'm especially tired this week because I've been up at 4 something or earlier every single day, in part because there's just been a heap happening. And again, we're going to talk about the pwned password stuff a little bit later on. Also in part because on Tuesday, I went down to Melbourne to do a talk. So for folks not familiar with the Australian geography, I've got to drive an hour north to go to Brisbane, so I can fly 2 hours south to go down to Melbourne. And because we don't have daylight saving in Queensland, because it would confuse the cows and the curtains would fade more, as I understand it, don't ask me why, it drives me nuts. Everywhere south of us is an hour ahead, so you've got to get up super early to be able to try and get down there at a reasonable time. So that was a bit of an early one. Went down to Melbourne, awesome bunch of people there. I did a talk at a nice restaurant while a bunch of people there were having lunch. And it was kind of cool. I was actually thinking about this just last night. I was talking to someone at a brewery. It was a kind of a work thing. It was an Mbraku party. I'll get back to that later on because I needed beer after yesterday in a brewery. I was talking to people going that, the cool thing about this job, and I think this industry in general, is that it's neat to be able to go from a sort of a nice sort of formal posh environment like the restaurant and a bunch of people in suits and C-suite positions and whatever else, and then you sort of turn around and be speaking to a bunch of folks wearing hoodies and breaking into stuff. I mean, I assume they're wearing hoodies. They're hackers. This is the thing that you have to do apparently. But on a serious note, it is a really nice variety. It's really nice that we have this level of diversity within the industry where there's so many different people doing different things at different levels. And I love the fact that I have the opportunity to talk to so many people like that. So that was really cool. Did the talk down in Melbourne. That was effectively raising awareness of what the data breach landscape is like at the moment, which, as you would well know, is not particularly good. And on that, there was a lot of talk about different incidents we've seen in the past, how companies have handled it, a little bit as well about the notifiable data breach scheme, which is hitting Australia yesterday, has hit Australia yesterday, which leads me through to the next thing that I've done this week. Yesterday, I did a webinar for Fortinet. They're a company who does a whole bunch of sort of related security things about Australia's NDB scheme, the Notifiable Data Breaches Scheme. Now, I thought I'd talk about it very briefly here because it is an interesting thing, and it's one sort of implementation of effectively mandatory disclosure. Now, we have had, and I say we as a collective society now, we have had, as a global society, mandatory disclosure laws in different parts of the world for quite some time. They've been in the US since the early 2000s. We've had them in the EU since the late 2000s. They're getting unified under GDPR. The US actually breaks them down state by state. They can be quite different. Australia hasn't had anything until yesterday. Now, there are aspects of the NDB scheme which I don't think go far enough, and I want to talk about those. But before I do that, let's talk about the positive stuff. Because frankly, given what I'm about to talk about after this, we need some good positive news. The positive stuff is that when you have a legal construct around mandatory disclosure, there is a discussion now that has to happen within organisations about how they're going to deal with these incidents. And I've heard from multiple CISOs in Australia that even though there are aspects we'd like to go further, and we'll talk about those in a moment, the fact there is now a law means that they can go and sit with the board and go, hey guys, there's now a law for this stuff. Like, we've got to plan for this and take it seriously and actually disclose under some circumstances, as we get to the caveats, if this happens. So what we have today is better than what we had a week ago. Now, let's talk about the gaps. There are 3 things I thought I'd highlight. And incidentally, that webinar should be made publicly available. I'll link to it if it's up in time for when I post this video later on today, my time. So 3 things. Number 1 is that you have to be a company with an annual turnover of $3 million or more. Now, that's 3 million Aussie dollars. So to put that in context, it's about 2.4 USD, 2.4 million USD. So the first thing there is that more than 90% of Australian businesses are under that size. So there's a bunch of stuff that just gets excluded. So that's the first thing. Now, there are some caveats there. So if you're handling tax file numbers, for example, if you're handling other sensitive classes of data, then the 3 million doesn't apply. You have to disclose anyway. So I think that the 3 million feels low. The other thing here is that the breach has to have caused serious harm, or has to have the potential to cause serious harm to the people in the incident. And I have an issue with this on multiple levels. One of those levels is that, let's say you've got a cat video site, right? And it's a really, really good cat video site. So you've got revenue of more than 3 million a year. And the only data you have about people are usernames and passwords. And you get breached and you go, it's just a cat video site. Like, how's a cat video site going to cause anyone any harm? All I've got is usernames and passwords for the cat video site. The problem is that the usernames and passwords on the cat video site are the same as the usernames and passwords on the banking site and the social media site and the stuff that people actually care about. So even though there might not be the potential for serious harm with the data alone in the context of the cat site, the broader ecosystem that then opens attackers up to could genuinely cause people serious harm. And in fact, when I did this webinar, I showed a little image of a service called Lifeboat, who a couple of years ago had 7 million records exposed. And they didn't disclose. And frankly, I think they're covering their own asses, but watch the webinar. They didn't disclose. And I have a screen cap of a tweet that a girl sent afterwards, after I ended up getting the data and sending it to the press, and it got very disclosed. And there's a tweet from this girl saying, literally all my usernames and passwords are the one from your service. And she specifically mentions things like social media. This is what people do. So I am worried about the serious harm thing. Not just because of the broader ecosystem, but because the caveats around this, or the way it's described, is something along the lines of a reasonable person would consider that it would cause serious harm. And it's just, it's a lot of lawyers have written this. And look, it's always lawyers that write this sort of stuff. I get that. But it feels like the holes there are big enough to drive a truck through. So on those first 2 points, the 3 million and the serious harm bit, one of the common threads that concerns me is that these laws are very focused around protecting the organisations who have lost the data. It's their fault, one way or the other. So why are we giving protections to the people who've done the wrong thing? And then the victims, people like you and me, because we've all been in data breaches, why are we as the victims the one who's not getting notified? Because I want to know. Like, if it's my data, I don't care what it is. I don't care if it's just my email address and you've lost it. I want to know. And I think I should be told. And at the end of the day, if you just send an email to say, hey, we lost your email address, and you make it a very nice email and you explain what happened, but it's just an email, I'll be okay with that. I won't be okay if you lose it and you don't tell me because you don't think I should know. Like, that's crap. Now, the third thing is you've got 30 days to actually fill out the assessment and submit it to the Oz government. And 30 days is a very long time. GDPR, you've got 72 hours to submit it to your local regulator. 72 hours after you discover the incident. Now, when I look back at data breaches that we've seen over recent years, and particularly ones I've been involved with closely, things like the Red Cross Blood Service, that's in my presentation. They were awesome. I mean, they lost my data, my wife's data, and the data of about 500,000 other Aussies. And within 72 hours, it wasn't just reporting it, it was the CEO standing up on national TV doing a press release about it. It was emails being sent, it was SMSs being sent, it was call centres equipped to handle queries from customers. There was a guy from the Red Cross Blood Service at my talk in Melbourne on Tuesday. Lovely guy too, very, very interesting. So that was a really good example of how this can be done. Discuss and Imager, data breaches I disclosed to them in about October, November last year. They both turned around within 24 hours. 24 hours. And notified everyone. Discuss had to notify 17 million people. This is how it should be done. This is the gold standard. And I don't think that 30 days or $3 million or serious harm are reasonable criteria. But again, to finish on a positive note, it is something that we didn't have a week ago. And it's like we were here and we didn't want to be here. And now we're here, but we really want to be here. So we're on this journey. So my hope is that over time, we move more this way. And I would really, really like to see a more unified approach between different countries as well. Because at the end of the day, we're all sort of online global citizens. We're putting our data all over the place. I'd love to see the Oz government go, hey, over in Europe and GDPR, that's pretty good stuff. Why don't we do that? And we'll align. And then if your data's exposed in Europe, but there's Aussie data in it, or Australia and there's European data in it, like everyone's playing to the same playing field. And I know this probably sounds like trying to solve world hunger or something like that, but I would love to get more unification. All right, let's move on past that and move on to some of the more contentious stuff. Where do I start with this? HTTPS. We have been on a march to HTTPS for quite some time. And when I say we've been on a march to it, if we look at everything from the attacks against insecure traffic through to the visual indicators in browsers, through to the easy availability of certificates through the likes of Let's Encrypt and Cloudflare, all the way through to things like the number of sites actually implementing it. Like everything is ticking up. Like this is where we're going. This is not open for debate, right? Everything is moving with more HTTPS and more attacks against insecure traffic and everything else. So this is what's happening. Now, there's a couple of things that, and I can't remember what spurred some of these debates, but I think it might have been two things I'll mention now. So one is that here's the chronology of it. So one is that as of about June or July, it's middle of the year, Chrome is going to start flagging all non-secure origins as not secure, explicitly. Now, let me quantify what I mean by that. As of today, if you go to, say, news.com.au, it is not a secure connection. So you don't see a padlock, you don't see the secure text. There is no visual indicator to tell you it's not secure. The reason you know it's not secure is because it doesn't tell you that it is secure. If you go to my blog, or Have I Been Pwned, or any one of millions and millions of websites out there that use HTTPS, you see a padlock and it says secure, and it's an explicit visual indicator telling you that. So see how it's kind of like we are not secure by default at the moment. Like that's the model. Now it's changing. So for example, in about Jan last year, we saw Chrome and Firefox start to flag any password fields or credit card fields. If you were requesting this information and you loaded those over HTTP, it would say not secure, explicitly in the browser. We got through to about October last year and Chrome started doing that with any input field on any page that was not secure. So that was kind of like another step, right? So now it's like the search box on CNN at the time. CNN has since gone HTTPS. You type one letter into the search box and then your browser goes, beep, not secure. So that happened. What's happening now is as of the middle of the year, Chrome will say not secure on every HTTP website. Now this is very, very important because it actually brings parity to both secure and not secure connections in that both of them are represented explicitly as opposed to one being implicit. So that's going to happen in the middle of the year. So if you are serving a website over HTTP, your website is going to start to say not secure. And that's a really important thing. One of the other things that's interesting is someone put out a tweet and said they're effectively, I forget whether the word was dog fooding or they're just pushing it out to a small number of people who may not necessarily be Google employees, but removing the EV visual indicator for extended validation certs. Now, I have said many things about EV before, and I'm going to say many more things about EV today as well. But you would know EV, if you go to Have I Been Pwned, you'll see EV, where it actually has the company name across the top. I'll talk later about why I've got to Have I Been Pwned, as opposed to not having the company name. And Chrome's saying, now we're going to start testing the removal of that. I don't know if that means they are going to remove it or they're just looking at it. All right, so two sort of contentious things. It's just getting darker and darker here, isn't it? I wonder if I hold this up and you get the light, the glow from my laptop, which is fine because I've got to read some stuff anyway. All right, lighting issues aside, there were a number of people that started very vigorous debates around HTTPS yesterday. And I want to sort of be really serious about one bit here for a moment. Some of this got very angry and frankly very vitriolic in a way that, look, if my kids did this, it would be a proverbial kick up the arse. You know, if you speak that way to people, not cool. Angry, aggressive, name-calling, and just, like, if you want to sort of see the history of it, just go through my tweet stream at pretty much about all of Thursday. And it was a really unpleasant thing to watch, and it really took away from what should have been technical discussions and very, very important debates around about the way the technology works. So I was very disappointed to see that. And some of these points were things like, some of the aggression was stuff like, there's one guy, I still got no idea who this guy is, popped up, and his argument as to why his site shouldn't need HTTPS is, don't you know who I am? I still don't know who the guy is. It was something along the lines of, don't you know who I am? And who are you? So, well, I've got a bio on my Twitter. I guess you could look at that. There's a link to my website. You could look at that. You could kind of work it out. But just very obnoxious, angry behavior. And it wasn't just this bloke. I don't want to just single one person out. There were totally separate threads where people were also very angry. Someone got very, very upset with the use of one word, which was technically correct, but they thought was misleading. And the behaviour of these people and the language they were using, again, if it was my kids, fair income, like they would have time out. You know, it'd be like, go and sit in the corner and put your manners back in. And I was just enormously disappointed in that behaviour. And I think I've said before, you know, for all of the events I go to and all the travel I go to, and I would meet thousands of people a year. When you add it all up around the world, I have never ever had anyone behave that way in person. And my little sort of dad talk for a moment is that if you should never behave in a way online that you wouldn't do in person. You know, this is going to be the lesson I give my kids as they start getting online. They're still a little bit young yet. Never say something or type something online that you wouldn't be happy to say to their face. In fact, my parents used to tell me this. They're like, don't say something behind someone's back you wouldn't say to their face because it might get back to them. It's that sort of thing. And frankly, if I see that behaviour, I'm muting you and moving on because I've got productive stuff I want to do. Now, with that out of the way, let me check actually, was there anything else? Yeah, that was the most thing. Rude, angry, obnoxious people. Anywho, with that out of the way, I want to talk about some of the technicalities here because people are raising issues which in some ways are valid and in other ways simply don't matter. So for example, there was the old debate coming up about the browser shouldn't say secure, it's misleading, you know? Okay, maybe it shouldn't, but this is what it does. And if you're building a website, you really want it to say secure as opposed to not secure. Because rightly or wrongly, people have a connotation that secure means high levels of trust and they will have more confidence in your site. That is a good thing. People were getting very uppity about HTTPS not being necessary for things like static sites. So one bloke was saying, I got these sites I built some time ago, you know, they're fine, they're static, don't need HTTPS. It's a really good website I'm going to put in my show notes as well, called doesmysiteneedhttps.com. And the first thing you see is a big yes, awesome. And the next thing you see under that is lots of practical reasons why it does. They're not all just security as well. Remember, when you have HTTPS, you can use HTTP2. You get a bunch of performance stuff out of that. You can use Brotli compression. That improves things. Google will give you an SEO boost. I can't believe we're still having this discussion. Like, why are we going round and round and round talking about whether or not we need HTTPS? It is well and truly happening, and we have known that it has been happening for a very long time. I'm going to link you to a Cloudflare blog post only from about a week ago where they talk about all the things that have happened over the years to indicate that we are moving to an HTTPS by default web. And eventually that's what it will be. We will get to the point sometime in future where we will see HTTPS as the norm and HTTP as an exception. And I don't know When it will be, I don't know if HTTP will be killed off altogether. I don't know if browsers will reject connections or put extra warnings. But the writing is on the wall that if you've got stuff served over HTTP, you're going to have issues. Someone was even arguing, saying, you got to fight back. I'm telling my customers not to put HTTPS on their websites. They got to fight back against the machine. I think some people think it's basically like Google trying to make money. They haven't really explained how Google's trying to make money by suggesting that organizations be secure, nor how Mozilla, who's a not-for-profit, is making money by doing similar things with Firefox. But yeah, here we are. It's the internet. People get angry. So there was some really crazy stuff there. Someone I noticed just this morning said you shouldn't have HTTPS because the RSA keys are easily cracked. So okay, that's bullshit too. It was just really weird. And one of the interesting things I found, just getting back very, very slightly to the debate side of things, is that in response to some of these really aggressive tweets, I was very tempted just to say, look, you're being a dick, you know, or to say what I think we're probably all thinking when we see things like that. And I rewrote some tweets over and over again before posting them. And when I look back on it now, everyone was a reasonable technical response. And I'm very, very happy about that. I noticed a tweet from a guy this morning who says, I lost a lot of respect for some I thought I respected as a result of that weird conversation, and gained more for yourself and Scott Helm, because Scott was involved in a lot of these tweets too. And it made me think, I've done this talk a bit over the last year called Hack Your Career, about building sort of online identities. And in there, I talk about what does your public profile say about you. And this is the sort of stuff I'm talking about. Because we've got someone here who believes he's well-respected or important and has made comments like that which cause people to respond in this way when they see that behaviour. And conversely, for Scott and myself, trying to sort of uphold a degree of professionalism, we came out of that looking quite good. I think if any reasonable person read through that tweet stream, regardless of all the technical things aside, just seeing behaviour and demeanour is really important. I know this is not a technical thing, but it's just important for me because I think we need to try and have a productive, inclusive environment on the web. And behaviour, like I saw yesterday, wasn't that. Now, I'm going to move on to something different. And you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to open another blind here just before I do. So for the people on the video side of things, give me just 1 second. The people on the audio, can listen to my blinds. And yeah, it's just more rain outside that window as well. But hopefully it's a little bit more light. Now, there was another interesting discussion which happened before all of the sort of aggressive aggro people that was started by a bloke. Now, I did mention this guy, so look, I'm going to talk about this in the video because I think there's some interesting points we need to tackle here. Guy called Andreas Malik, who's the CEO at Cert Center. Now, Cert Center sells certs. And this was a debate around EV certs. Now, I mentioned those just before. The reason I've got an EV cert on Have I Been Pwned is that I wanted to go through the process. I wanted to do it. I wanted to see things that were involved. I blogged about it at the time. You can search for my name, EV Cert, if I forget to put it in the show notes. And then I wanted to see how people behaved with it. And it's been a really interesting experience, and it has shaped my views on EV to the point where I feel it's pretty much irrelevant. You know, there's really no viable, tangible upside whatsoever. Now, in fairness, there's not much of a downside. There are some downsides. I'll touch on those. But it really doesn't give you any value. Now, I'm going to try and put this as factually as we can. Certificate authorities, for the longest time, have sold certs. So you could go to, say, Komodo, and you could buy a DV cert, a domain validation cert, where they make sure you control the domain. If you control the domain, they give you the cert. Even if you're a phishing site, they'll give you the cert, because phishing sites still deserve certificates. I know that upsets some people, but DV certs are, do you own the domain? Yes, you get a cert. They're not, do you own the domain and you're a nice person? Then you get a cert. There are other nice person tests, such as Chrome Safe Browsing and things like that. So DV certs, been around for the longest time. Now, Let's Encrypt came along, started giving them away for free about 2 years ago. And Let's Encrypt is now the largest issuing CA on the internet. They've done very, very well. What do you reckon happens when a CA comes along and starts giving away something for free that others were charging for? Not so happy. EV certs, they can still charge for. And in fairness, they should charge for them because there's a lot involved. There's a lot of validation of the entity that is applying for the certificate. When I did mine, I literally had to talk to people on the phone, had to have a Skype video chat. I had to hold my passport up next to my face and smile while they took a photo of me because they need to be confident I am who I say I am. And again, this is why I did it for Have I Been Pwned. I wanted to go through this process. Now, ultimately, for the end user, the only difference between a DV cert and an EV cert is what they see in the address bar. That is the only thing at all. So you can see why CAs selling EV, first of all, want to push you towards EV because they can charge money for it, and secondly, would be pretty unimpressed if Chrome or another browser did start to remove the visual representation. So, and incidentally, there's some interesting nuances here. Because it's just a visual representation, it's up to the browser to decide what it looks like. If you go to Safari on iOS, you won't see a URL on an EV site, you'll just see the company name. If you go to Chrome on iOS, you won't see the company name, you'll just see the padlock, and it looks just like DV. So it's actually up to the client to implement this stuff. All right, so Andreas made a bunch of points here, and I want to go through and tackle each one of these. I tried doing it over Twitter, but a combination of character limitations, and I think Twitter often, when things get a bit more enthusiastic, doesn't necessarily convey sentiment. So I want to be respectful to his points as well, because he did have points that are made over and over again. So, a few things here. He said, even my 70-year-old mother knows the difference between EV and other certificates. The problem with EV is that EV relies on a change of behaviour in the absence of an EV cert. So let me explain what I mean by this. The value proposition of EV is you have a high degree of confidence in the site you go to because you can see the company name, you can see that they've had to jump through hoops to get it. You can see, for example, let's say PayPal. PayPal has EV. You can say, hey, it says PayPal, I must be on the PayPal site. Now, that the point I made about the absence of EV is that it really only does you any good if when you go to a site that isn't PayPal and you don't see it say PayPal, then you don't trust it. So, for example, if it was a misspelling of PayPal or there were some Unicode characters that look very similar to, when rendered, look very similar to the normal Latin characters, people have to change behaviour. If they don't change behaviour and they still trust the site, then EV hasn't done its job. The top 10 websites in the world don't use EV. And this was one of the blog posts I put out around about last year. I'll link to that one as well. And the interesting thing here is that I actually tweeted a screen cap. Top 10 websites not using EV. And one of them is Twitter. And a bunch of people came back and said, well, Twitter does. Here you go. Like, here's a screen cap of it. And sure enough, like, their tweets actually had EV for Twitter. And then I'm going, but mine doesn't have this. And then this guy from Norway popped up. And the guy from Norway said, but mine doesn't have it either. And what we actually learned is that Twitter was selectively serving EV in different locations and DV in other locations. Locations that I travel around to. I go to these places. I'm the guy that looks for this sort of stuff, and I never knew. And when I go and do talks at conferences, I've been doing this talk, I did it in London and Oslo last month, talking about EV. And I asked the audience, I go, okay, this is the value proposition of EV. Who thinks Facebook has EV? World's largest website. One of the world's largest websites. And a whole bunch of hands go up. And I'm like, okay, so if I show you Facebook now, and it only has DV, not EV, would you still trust it? And of course, Facebook doesn't have EV. And people are like, wow, yeah, I do still use it. I wouldn't actually change my behavior. So the point here about the grandmother, it just simply doesn't hold water. First of all, most technical people I speak to don't know the difference between EV and DV. And again, I'm speaking between conferences and workshops. This is thousands and thousands of people per year. The vast majority don't know the difference, and just about everyone has got no idea which sites should have it or not. So this premise of somehow changing your behavior in the absence of it, this is just not how it works. This is not human behavior. Okay, a problem is that browsers want to kill CAs. They want to get the full control over the market. They don't want to kill CAs. Browsers are pushing headlong into HTTPS, for which they need CAs. And again, like, everyone likes to blame Google because they think Google's evil now. This is Mozilla going toe-to-toe with a lot of these visual indicators with Chrome as well. And again, Mozilla, open source, or rather open foundation, not-for-profit, like they are driving us in the same direction. They do not have a financial mandate. They're pushing HTTPS because it gives you security. And ironically, like I realize we just had the discussion about the angry people on Twitter getting upset that we're pushing HTTPS when we shouldn't be. And then I got the other side of it, which is the CAs and those folks saying there should be more HTTPS in terms of EVs and things than what there should be. It's like, oh man, somewhere in the middle is a sane discussion. Anyway, so no, the browser vendors are not trying to kill CAs. They want these CAs. In fact, Mozilla is one of the backers of Let's Encrypt, so they're definitely not trying to kill them. Maybe he means they're trying to kill commercial CAs by virtue of funding not-for-profit CAs, and Let's Encrypt is not-for-profit. Maybe that's it. That is a financial motive as opposed to it being the wrong technical thing. Browsers removed the EV indicators and now they claim that nobody cares about EV. Well, no, they haven't removed the EV indicators. Chrome on the PC, Firefox on the PC, same with other browsers on different devices. Like I mentioned, Safari on iOS literally gives you the EV name that's on the certificate. There's this one thing I mentioned earlier, which is Chrome is looking at whether it should be removed or not, but they haven't killed it, and they're not now claiming no one cares as a result of that. If they're claiming no one cares, it's because no one actually cares, but it's not because it's been removed and people are now missing it. Nowadays, it's trendy to be pro-browser and against CAs. Maybe that makes me trendy, I don't know. And I'm not against CAs either. I'm just against them charging you money for things you can now get for free. And again, I think that makes a bit of the problem here. Just think about it. My posts are so uncool. It might be a different problem. It's so popular to be pro-browser. Look, I mean, I think the problem is that once you start having debates and there's financial motives involved, a lot of the rational technical discussion goes out the window. And if we take all of the money side of it out for a moment, the more secure we have our traffic and the more HTTPS and the more access to things like HTTP2 and Brotli and enhanced Google SEO, etc., the more of all that we get, the better. It is a good thing for everyone. There are no rational downsides. So it's not that. At least the CA is validating the existence of the company and the registrant behind the certificate plus the domain rights before the issuance. In my eyes, that's way safer than a phishing site which got a Let's Encrypt certificate. CAs really don't like Let's Encrypt, we know why, which indicates secure in the browser. Now, again, I think there is an entirely reasonable discussion around what the browsers should say. And I'm going to actually read you a quote by Scott Helm a little bit later on, which I thought was very insightful around this. But ultimately, we don't want to see secure in the browser because we want HTTPS to be the default. We need to flip the model at the moment, which is if it is not secure, you don't see anything. You know, we want to get to the point where secure is the norm, and then non-secure is the stuff that gets brought to people's attention. So, you know, this is really not the issue. And again, phishing sites have exactly the same rights as every other site to get a certificate. This is not what certificates are for. I mentioned safe browsing before. You'll notice that your ISPs and your telcos will very often identify phishing sites as malicious independently of HTTPS and block them. I know Freedom VPN does this as well. There are lots of different ways of blocking phishing sites, whether they're HTTP or HTTPS. Chrome also removes certificate pinning, right? In my eyes, they are working against security. And then actually, I'll read the next one too, and we'll talk about HPKP. And of course, when he says certificate pinning, he means public key pinning. And sorry guys, I know it's getting really dark in here. I hope the audio works okay. Maybe this just looks more hacker-like. They removed that feature, HPKP, of course, way too complex for us, the administrators. Well, actually, yes. Now, he did a little tongue-in-cheek thing after that. But he's right. HPKP was too complex. And let's actually recap on what HPKP does, because this is really important. HTTP public key pinning was the ability to take the public key of a certificate or an intermediate certificate or even your certificate signing request and pin it to the browser by way of a response header. Now, we won't go into the technicalities of it because it's getting killed off. It's not something that we need to go into detail for. Main thing is that it would protect you against a rogue certificate being issued that was valid for your domain. So imagine like the DigiNotar scenario a few years ago, where allegedly the Iranian government owned this Dutch certificate authority, issued certificates for Google.com. Now, if HPKP was there and certificates were actually pinned, then we wouldn't have had this problem, because if a Did You Know Task certificate was served up for Google and the browser said, well, that's not the key that I was expecting a different key, you drop the connection. Now, for someone like Google, that actually makes a bit of sense. The problem is that we saw lots of websites trying to implement this and totally screwing it up. Smashing Mag, perfect example. Google Smashing Mag and HPKP. They messed this up, and there were many other companies that got this messed up as well. There are a few that Scott Helm and I were involved in where they had, and I think what actually happens here is you'd have a situation like the developer has added an HPKP header because they think it's a good idea. There's someone else administering the search, they've rotated the search, site breaks. And it was literally HPKP suicide. This is a term. It is a real thing. And this was an absolute disaster for these websites because people could no longer come there. And the thing is as well, I mean, let's take Smashing Mag. Imagine you are, hypothetically, the Iranian government and you own a certificate authority. Of all the sites that you could start manning the middling traffic for, the sites that would prove valuable to an adversary who is sophisticated enough to be able to own a CA, is Smashing Mag the site you'd choose? It's not. You would be choosing, probably in the case of a government trying to intercept communication, something like Google, as they did, or a messaging platform, maybe a financial institution. You're not going to pick Smashing Mag. So all that's happened here is they've put themselves at a much higher elevated sense of risk, which did come to fruition, and they had major issues because of it, for no tangible upside whatsoever, because unless, and this is a quote Scott often says, he says, unless you are effectively like one of the most important sites on the web, it makes no sense. And there's not many most important sites on the web. So HPKP was killed off because, yes, it is too complex for administrators. People screwed it up, and there was just not enough tangible upside for it. We've had things like CAA come along, which sort of partly address the problem there, and other controls which effectively made HPKP dangerous. So Google is removing it from Chrome. This is important. It was actually never in the Microsoft browsers. Microsoft was very ahead of the game on that. Let's just agree with that. so it was never in those. It's going out of Chrome. HPKP is gone for very good reasons. Now, I explained this. I said, look, HPKP is risky. And he said, HSTS Preload is also risky, but that does not make it useless. Let's talk about HSTS Preload because it is a very, very different construct with much more practical benefits and much lower risk. HTTP Strict Transport Security is a response header. You return it on an HTTPS connection, which then allows the browser to say, hey, this site says it should always be loaded over HSTS, over HTTP. Over HTTPS. Early mornings. So browser says, okay, it's always got to be HTTPS. There's a max age attribute, which says for this many seconds from now, it must always be secure. Fantastic if you actually have one good trusted connection to the site. It's a trust on first use problem, a tofu problem. So you get that one good connection, save the certificate, or rather save the HSTS header, job done. The thing is that you've always got that first risk. You've got to get one good connection. And if someone goes to the browser and just types, for argument's sake, haveibeenpwned.com, the browser by default will make an HTTP connection because we just had the discussion about browsers and everything defaulting to non-secure. What Preload does is it allows you to go to hstspreload.org, put your URL in there, and so long as you've added a preload keyword to your HSTS header and you meet some other criteria, stuff like you've got to have a valid certificate, you've still got to have a max age that's valid for, I think it's at least a year now. It used to be 6 months. You have got to, what are some of the other criteria? You've obviously got to have the keyword attribute. You've got to include subdomains as well, and that does exactly what it sounds like it does. If you have all that, you go to HSTS Preload, you put your domain in there, it's run by the Chromium project. All the major browser vendors then take that list, build it into their browser. When you first download their browser and run that site, so you put in haveibeenpwned.com, the browser already knows before making a connection that it has to be secure. So this is a fantastic way, and ultimately this is where we want to go. In fact, we'll get to the point where we will be secure by default and we won't even need HSTS. That'll be later on. So he said HSTS Preload is also risky. Let's talk about the risks. First of all, you can't get preloaded unless you meet those criteria. Valid certificate, long max age, redirecting HTTP to HTTPS, include subdomains. All that gets validated. So if a site's not already doing all those things, which effectively forces it to run HTTPS anyway, you don't get preload. Now, the risk is, let's say, for example, you had a subdomain that you wanted to serve over HTTP, not securely. Well, now you've got a problem because the preload requirement of include subdomain is going to make sure that, let's say, my non-secure domain.haveibeenpwned.com, the browser will only request it securely. The fix is you put a certificate on it. So when we talk about it being risky, the fix is not risky. The fix is what we should be doing anyway. It's different to HPKP. The fix for HPKP is use another browser. If you screw that up, use another browser. Or you can go into your net internals in Chrome and actually delete the pin, which you can't exactly tell your mum and dad investors at home trying to log onto their freaking bank after you've screwed it up. So very, very different. Fix for HPKP is every single user has got to do something different. The fix for HSTS, which is unlikely to break in the first place because of those requirements, is that you serve the content securely. It's something that you do to your own site. Totally different can of worms. Let me see now. For us, especially in Germany, he was from Germany, it works very well. Try to get a certificate for Cert Center AG within the next 90 days and your assertion is proven. I mean, there's nothing, sorry to any Germans, but there's nothing special about Germany. I mean, okay, Autobahn's beers, stuff like that. But in terms of HTTPS, it works the same way as everywhere else. And if you go to Alexa and you look at the top websites in Germany, barely any of them have got EV. They're all still just EV. So there's an interesting point here. This is the comment from Scott, actually. So Scott says, I can't wait to see Padlock's Green secure or any of that gone. Why? Because it means we reached a point where secure comms is the norm, because we succeeded, and this is what we should all be aiming for. I would love to see nothing at all. There should be bells and whistles and stuff going off as an insecure site, and we will get there. We are moving there. And for the HTTPS anti-vaxxers, several people use that term. It wasn't me that came up with it. It was either anti-vaxxers or flat earthers, people who deny HTTPS. This is where we're going to go. And you can tell your customers all day long not to go and get it and fight against the machine, whatever other words you want to come up with, but that's not going to change the fact that it's happening. It's pointless having a discussion about this should not be happening. There is a good discussion to be had that is a longer term discussion with the likes of browser vendors around what are the correct visual indicators to have in a secure by default world. And I will agree with the CAs in that I think, commercial CAs, in that I think there is a good case to be made for some form of verification of the entity and some sort of visual indicator. But it's only going to make sense when it changes user behavior. For all the rest of us actually trying to build stuff and make stuff work, this is how it works now. Let the other guys go and have the argument about how things should change in the future. If you're delivering websites, they should be on HTTPS. You'll get no benefit from EV. Incidentally, I visited a bank recently and I did a talk at the bank. The bank is seriously considering removing EV. The reason why is they said it actually poses quite a risk to us if we need to go and get another cert quickly. Let's say they need to rotate keys. If we need to go and do that, it's a risk because the requirements are so onerous. And if the people that we need to go through all the identity verification stuff are not easily to hand, we're going to have a serious problem. Now, of course, in that case, they could just fall back to DV and go and get a domain validated cert from Let's Encrypt or something like that very, very easily. But they are now starting to have the discussion about should we proactively do that because having EV is actually risky in other ways. I thought that was very interesting. I hadn't thought about that angle before. Okay, so we're like 43 minutes through, which is a normal length for one of these weekly updates, and I haven't even spoken about pwned passwords yet. I'm going to do this now, and in fact, while I think of it, I am going to link people at the start of the blog post to where you want to possibly drill down to in terms of if you want to jump past all the HTTPS shenanigans and get to this. Let's talk about pwned passwords, because pwned passwords I'm super stoked with, and I wanted this week to all just be excitement and joy about this thing. And around this thing it is, so let's focus on the good stuff. So, in August last year, I released Pwned Passwords version 1 as part of Have I Been Pwned? 320 million passwords that have appeared in data breaches. I got them all, I SHA-1 hashed them to give a level of protection to some of the PII, which is in some of those original passwords, and I made it available to download. And you could pull this data down, and you could then, when someone registers, changes the password, logs on, you could then SHA-1 hash their password, compare it to the data set, and if it was in that data set, you could go, hey, you're using a password that's been seen before. I think most people who watch this video are aware of what I did there. So that was fine. I wanted to do new stuff with V2, and there are a few significant things. So number one, a lot more data. So there's now over 500 million. It's like 501 million. I just kept finding data until it ticked over the 500 million because it sounds cool. But in all seriousness, I went and grabbed most of the resources that were a good enough ROI on the effort. Return on investment on the effort. You know what I mean. It made sense to load them. So ticked over 500 million. So the number's big. Number two is I've put a count next to every single one of those hashes. So if you, let's say you have someone register on your site and they use a password that's in the data set. Some of the feedback I got from V1 is organizations said, it's one thing to actually know that the password's been exposed before, but we would like to know how bad it is. Was it exposed once? Was it exposed 100 times? Because we may not necessarily want to block 320 million passwords, or even now over 500 million passwords. That actually poses some usability problems. But there are definitely some passwords we want to block. We want to block the worst million, 2 million, something like that. So this was actually really important information to help people use the dataset better. So there's now prevalence. So if you download this data, every single hash has a number next to it. And that number is going to tell you how bad it is. And in fact, I've sorted it in descending order. So if you just want to take the first 1 million rows or something, there's the 1 million worst passwords. So that was really cool. Now, that was my plan. I was going to have the 500 million. I didn't know how many it would be. I was just going to have a lot more. And I was going to have this idea of how bad it is. And then Cloudflare reached out to me last month. And in fact, there's a bloke called Junard Ali. And sorry, Junard, if I pronounced your name wrong. He is Icy April on Twitter, and you'll see him mentioned in my blog post on this. And Junard said, look, we would like to integrate Pwn Passwords version 1. He didn't know I was doing version 2. And he said, what we'd actually like to do is provide a service where what you can do is you can hit an API endpoint and you can figure out if the password was in one of these data breaches. But there's the privacy issue because you don't want people submitting passwords to some random site. And I mean, for the sake of fairness, Have I Been Pwned is sort of a random site, and Cloudflare would be a random site too, insofar as it's like a third party. So we don't want to just take a password, send it off to a third party, because who knows what they're doing with it. So there is a necessity to ensure some privacy. So he worked on a model that implemented a mathematical property called k-anonymity. And the idea here is there should be a way of having a subset of what it is that you want to search for, the password in this case, comparing it to a big list, getting back a bunch of results, giving those results to the person doing the search, and then the person doing the search can narrow it down out of that set. Let's put this in real terms. What he proposed is that we take the SHA-1 hash, we take the first 5 characters of that hash, we send that to a range search. The range search comes back and says, okay, you've searched for, let's say for argument's sake, 00000, 5 zeros. Coffee again. You give 5 zeros. And you're going to then get back a set of results. Let's say several hundred results. And those several hundred results are going to have the remaining characters in that SHA-1 hash. What that means is that you can then take your 5 zeros, you can add it to all of those results that come back. So now you've got complete SHA-1 hashes again. And then you can compare that to the full hash that you never send the service. You're only sending the service the first 5 characters. So you're never sending the full hash to the service. The service only sees those 5 character prefixes. The service could say, maybe the full password is one of those several hundred. Might be. It might also be one that's not even in the list. And this is sort of the k-anonymity property where we never have enough information to have any reasonable degree of confidence in what the password actually is. Now, when I implemented this, and I'm going to look at some of my stats. Well, actually, we've got to go back a bit because they were going to do it in Cloudflare. And then I said, hey, I'm doing this version 2 thing, a lot more data and everything. And we basically got around to the point of saying, well, what if we just build it into Have I Been Pwned? And rather than Cloudflare build their own thing, they can just point to Have I Been Pwned. And I'm using Cloudflare day in and day out for everything that I do on the line anyway, so, it seems like a pretty good fit. So they said, yep, that's cool, let's do that, and we'll point people to your thing. And I was like, well, that's awesome, because I can use Cloudflare and talk about all the other cool stuff that you guys do. And incidentally, like, I've been talking about Cloudflare for years. It is just a really, really neat model. This is not like they've done something cool and now I feel compelled to talk about it. So it's not that at all. So we said, all right, let's build that out. Now, what it means in real terms, I'm going down to the k-anonymity property, or part of the blog post here. What it means in real terms is that between 5 zeros and 5 Fs, we have a total of 16 to the power of 5 different combinations that can be searched for. Now, this is just over 1 million from memory. So there's sort of 1 million plus possible ranges that can be searched for. On average, each range has 478 matches. So what this means is that if you search for, let's say, A, B, C, D, E, the 5 characters, you'll get back on average 478 SHA-1 suffixes. The smallest data set, or the smallest range, has 381 hashes. So that's sort of the least private search, if you like, is when you send those 5 characters and I go, well, it could be any one of these 381 things or something that's not in my list. The largest has 584 in the range. So, you know, that's sort of the maximum anonymity. Could be any one of these sort of 584 things. So that was really cool, and I thought, okay, we'll stand this up. My original plan, I had this great idea. I woke up in the middle of the night one night, and I thought, what I'll do is I will use a Cloudflare worker role. Do they call it worker role? Or, no, just Cloudflare worker. Cloudflare worker, which is effectively code on the edge. So you can write code that runs in each one of their 121 edge nodes around the world. And what that means is that when a request comes into their infrastructure, your code can do something with it and manipulate the request or the response rather than just pass it through and then get data back. And what I was going to do is I was going to point it directly at Cosmos DB in Azure. So this is their sort of evolution of the storage. And I was going to point it there and I was going to query their HTTPS endpoint. And as it worked out, Cosmos isn't really meant to be used in that way. The way you prepare authentications and tokens and things didn't really lend itself to that model. So ultimately what I did is I put all of this data in Azure table storage. And someone asked me today how I partitioned it. So just for the record, the way I've partitioned it is the first 5 characters of that SHA-1 hash are the partition key. The suffix is the row key, which is really cool because if I need to pull just one record out, so you can still just search by a hash, I can say, take the hash, grab the first 5 characters, that's partition, the rest of it, that's the row, go and pull this one record out. When you do the range search, I can say, take the SHA-1, well, in fact, I only get the first 5 characters, take those first 5 characters, then just go and grab the whole partition. Here's, on average, 478 records. So super, super, super fast lookup in table storage. I wanted to make sure that we could scale this thing in a crazy way. Because I'm thinking, well, if Cloudflare starts telling people to use this, and it actually protects anonymity, and services do start using it, what if it goes nuts? What if it's wildly successful? Good result, but how am I going to explain to my wife that we're suddenly paying a lot of money so people can search for breached passwords? Like, it didn't really sit particularly well. So I did a couple of things. I used Azure functions. So there is an HTTP triggered Azure function. That is the endpoint when you do that search. An Azure function is serverless computing. It is code as a service. So it's like write code, publish it to the cloud. Every time it executes, I pay a little bit of money. Now, when it executes, it talks to table storage, pulls back the result, returns it. So the first thing is that it can scale infinitely, but with a direct line through to my wallet. So there's that. But the second thing is, as I started building this out, now I think, honestly, this is the coolest thing that I'm most happy about with this service, and I didn't pre-plan it. I just realized as I went along. I went, there's only like 1 million plus ranges. When you're searching by range, it's not a particularly sensitive piece of data. We can persist that somewhere. What if I just set a really long cache expiry? So what if I set the cache expiry for a month so that when that function responds and you're doing a search for A, B, C, D, E, and it returns those 478 results, what if we just cache that at Cloudflare's edge in the 121 edge nodes around the world? Because if it was cached for a month, once one person does a search, then it won't need to hit the origin database again. This is smart, right? Now, not only does it not need to hit the origin database, because it doesn't do that, I don't have to pay for the function execution. I don't have to pay for the transaction on the Azure storage. And one of the best bits is the person making the query gets an immediate response from a Cloudflare Edge node. So I had people messaging me yesterday going, are you sure I'm searching through 500 million records? Because it's just come back in like 15 milliseconds over the wire. I was like, that's the joy of caching, because you have literally pulled this data from a data center somewhere in your local city because it's cached. And I'm so happy with this model because it just makes everyone enormously happy. I'm happy because my stuff is going to scale really well. My wife is happy because we're not going to pay too much for it. Cloudflare is happy because they get to have a really, really cool use case for their cache implementation. I assume they're happy. I hope you guys are happy. And the people using it are happy because they get super fast responses. So this is epic. I'm just so happy about the way this works. I've had enormously positive feedback about this over the last day. And really, this is what I wanted to focus on all of yesterday, not HTTPS shenanigans, where people have been absolutely stoked about this. And within less than an hour of me pumping this out, people were already writing things against the API. So we've got websites consuming the API. People have posted bash scripts. Someone's made a NuGet package for .NET as a wrapper. And I think they actually said, look, there's not a lot of point because it's just such a simple implementation. But hey, someone's building stuff against it and putting it out there. The really, really, really super cool one I just tweeted about only about an hour ago is 1Password, the password manager, has integrated it into their platform. Now, this blew me away. They did not know this was coming. I gave them no warning whatsoever. And then out of the blue, yesterday afternoon, this would have been less than 12 hours after I pushed it, they got in touch and said, hey, what we want to do is we want to have a feature which you can toggle, so there's a keyboard shortcut to turn it on. And when you turn this on, you'll be able to, on one of your passwords, go check it against pwned passwords, and it will come back and tell you if it had previously been pwned. They pushed that out this morning. I think I figured out it was about 27 hours after launch. Isn't that cool? Like within 27 hours of one of the world's most prominent password managers out there learning about this, they've already built the code, implemented it, pushed it out, people can use this now. Now this is epic. And I'm happy with them doing that because you're hitting these caches. You're not pulling it back from my origin. You guys can scale that to billions of requests a day for all I care. It's awesome. So you can sense the excitement. I'm really, really happy about the way that's worked. Now, some other things here. I do still support the old model of querying by an individual hash if you want to, and then it just returns an integer. How many times did that hash appear? I should look at some stats at some point about how many of each are being consumed. I can look at how many times each of the Azure functions is being called. I'm actually wondering if there was really much point of even doing the individual query by hash because the range thing is just so awesome. So we can check that. It's interesting to look at how different the timing is as well for one of the cache results versus a non-cache result. So for me in Australia here, and remember, all the internet connectivity here is crap. I was seeing 535 milliseconds roughly when it had to go to the origin, and I was seeing 18 milliseconds when it got it from a local Cloudflare Edge node. That is a big difference. That's 25-fold over, something roughly like that. So that is really, really, really cool. What else? I think that's pretty much about it. Like the pwned passwords are now out there and they're getting used in just super awesome ways. And I really have enjoyed seeing so much positive feedback about it and people saying, this is stuff that we can do good things with. It's all free. There's no licensing stuff. You don't even have to mention have I been pwned if you want to use it in your service because I want people to use it to do good things. And maybe this is a good sort of place to start wrapping up. Like, these are the discussions we should be having. How do we move things forward in a way that's good for everyone? And I don't care about the money side of it or who's motivated by what sort of financial levers. This is just a good thing to do. And I'm really, really happy to see it being used this way. So that is awesome. That's a good note to end on. In fact, the very, very last note is my sponsor for this week is Tech Fabric. And I think this is actually the first week we've had Tech Fabric on. So I'm going to link to Tech Fabric there in the notes as well. I like having a nice array of different vendors, of different sponsors doing different things actually on the site. So it's good to have a bit of a mix there. They do scalable, reliable, and secure cloud-native applications. There's a link through to them at the top of my blog of the moment. I'll put it in the show notes at the bottom too. And that was everything that was in my notes. So I think on that note, we're just about to tick over an hour here on this podcast. And like I said, it was intended to be mostly pwned passwords. We ended up with a lot of HTTPS on there. But these are important industry issues. And I hope that, look, at the very least, everyone sort of proceeds, whether it be with the pwned passwords or the HTTPS stuff, with good intentions and treats everyone with respect and just enjoys what is really a pretty awesome community to be a part of. Thank you very much for listening to this extra epic long one. I'll come to you from home, probably a little bit more awake, next week before I head back to the US again for a couple of weeks. Thanks for watching, guys.